Hi there. Hello. Wow, there's a lot of you. OK, so as Rosie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about modular architecture, in a sense. When I was trying to figure out exactly what I was talking about, though, I had some problems with it. So because I'm really talking about components and classes, in a sense, because of how we built the web lately. But actually, it's more components and modifiers, right? Because we all use BEM, in a sense. But it's more components, modifiers, and overrides, or components, patterns, and shit is hard to deal with, which is kind of the thing that's stuck in my mind. I don't have a solution for the title of this talk, so I got along with it. My name is Marco, Chadmax, everywhere on the internet. I used to be a webmaster. Yay. Any other webmaster back in the days here? Raise your hands, please. A few. OK, cool. And I'm the lead engineer, one of the lead engineers at Crowdcube. So yeah, this is the title of the talk, Components, Patterns, and shit is hard to deal with. Sorry for the swearing, I'm Italian. And it was a good opportunity for me to come up with a good use of quotes from Lost in Translation. Have you seen the movie? Lost in Translation? OK. So you might wonder what Lost in Translation has to do with anything about components and modular architecture and stuff like that. It does not. It's more about my talk. So this is what I think is an accurate review of the movie. Anyone of the people that saw the movie thought that this is accurate? OK. So my talk is not going to have answers for you. There is no recipe to deal with what I'm going to talk about. So there might be the chance that you get at the end of it, and there's like, what did I just saw? I hope not, but it might be. Actually, the truth is that this talk comes from a long way. And this is a quote from Alla Kolmatova back in 2015. And she was saying that meaning is complex and often gets lost in translation. Do you see what I did here? Everybody has their own mental model of things. So again, she was talking about modular design. She was very focused on the design part of it. But I think that thing can be translated to the developer part as well. So I'm going to give you some background about it. Sorry, by the way, the timer is not working, and I'm not sure about my timing, but just good. So in 2015, I was working at Shazam. This was my team, and as you can see, Umar and I were trying to build a modular system. That's why we were a little into that. Flav wasn't doing much. He was playing with the dog. But so back in the days, we were building this modular system. We were trying to do the best practices and stuff like that. Our stack wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't React or Angular or whatever it was back in the days. We used Mustache, Akaze, which was an internal framework we built. We were using the BAM notation for our front-end CSS. This was kind of the stack we were working with. And we were struggling a bit, in a sense, figuring out how to work with these things to make something that was really portable and modular as it should have. So again, that came from a long way, right? Like it was October 2013 when Brad Frost released an article talking about atomic design. And I think most of us still have that in mind, these atoms, molecules, organisms, templates. And I still divide my folders of front-end assets with this kind of structure, or similar to this anyway. And so we've been learning about this componentization of the web and of how we build the web since 2013, at least. But we go back even further. Like 2011, it was announced the start of the works on web components, which, if you agree with me, they kind of under-delivered nowadays. It's been 6 years. We haven't seen much, really. But we were eager to get that and to work with that because we wanted that type of isolation and that type of componentization of our work. But even further back, this is Anna Debenham in 2014. She mentioned that she heard about using pattern libraries back in 2009 for web projects. And this is not something that should come weird at your ears, because like in the end, pattern libraries are used since ages in design in general. It's just that we got to apply them to the web design late, because probably our industry got to mature at a different point than the design as a general broad technique. So we come a long way from componentization of our work. I think the triggering point for most of us, though, was React.js. So when React was released in 2013, which is 4 years ago, we actually started to build things in a very modular way, or at least some of us, and some others got involved in the conversation because React was kind of disruptive in the way that it got into the market. Again, you can like it or not, but you have to admit that it did give this change to us in how we perceive components. So where are we at today? What are we doing after all these years talking about componentization, pattern libraries, modular system, etc.? What are we struggling at? And so I tried to frame the issue that I have in my mind that was rambling around. Have you seen what I did there? Framing lost in translation? Huh? Nice. So Hala, in that talk, said what I think is very accurate, that when you actually try to apply a modular approach to your day-to-day work, it isn't really that simple. Again, she was talking about design, but I think we all know as developers that we do have the same problem to a certain extent. Have you ever been in the situation in which you feel like you're trying to fit a square in a round hole? Any one of you got that sense working with modular systems? OK, so I've been there many, many times. And before I move on to the next part, I need to define, to give you a common definition of what I intend for pattern library in my talk. Because with pattern libraries, design system, modular system, and stuff like that, there are so many ways of perceiving the message that is conveyed. It's very loaded as a word, pattern library. So it would require a whole talk, actually, to talk about pattern libraries. So I'm not going to do that. For the purpose of the talk, the important thing for me is that I define pattern library as something that contains all the visual elements that we could use to build our website, and they could be basically swapped in a low-definition mock in a seamless way to build our thing. Like that's what I want you to think about when I mention pattern library in my talk. Again, it's way more loaded. There are way more meanings, and it's a very simplification of the problem, but it's enough to understand where I'm leading to. OK. So the issue for me, the main issue I've been seeing over all these years is that we got to a point in which we need in our code somehow to break the boundaries of the pattern library, because we receive requests that are slightly different from the pattern that is there already, or we see that there is an opportunity to reuse something if only we added this small tweak. So there are a lot of these subtle changes that pattern don't embrace by themselves, and then makes us feel like the pattern library becomes a cage rather than a proper tool for us to work. So again, how do we reuse our patterns in a slightly different use cases? This is what I'm trying to tackle here. And this is how I feel about that. I wish I could sleep. Lost in translation. Just to give you some context, this is not about any specific tech stack. My examples in the code are going to be with React, but that's just for convenience. Everything can be applied to any stack, because it's about modularity, it's about responsibility of the modules to each other, and it's about maintainability of the code and other coding practices. So don't be bothered about React. It's not a React talk. Another thing to mention is that some of the stuff that you see on screen, if you use CSS modules or some sort of CSS in JavaScript, might be handled for you. I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying that some of these problems might come at you in why do you have to do that. Don't worry. Most of the people doesn't use CSS in JS for good reasons. Some of the people use that for good reasons. We're not debating that. I'm just saying. So one of the techniques I found that was used quite often is the class name injection. And again, my thought is I'll be at the bar for the rest of the week every time I see that happening. So by class name injection, I mean that we have an icon button pattern, and then we inject a class name referring to the context in which this icon button is mounted. Oh, all the examples are real code that either I wrote or someone else wrote in my team, not at Crowdcube, former companies, because I just joined them. But yeah, so it's real working code out there. So what happens when you do that is that in the context of the content actions, you define and override the button. You may see where the problem lives, because like, how does this rule play with the rules that define the button itself? Like, are we overriding anything? Are we adding to the scope of the button? What happens if I change the button implementation and I don't use flex anymore, for example? What does that flex mean anyway? But also, stuff that seems a little less scary is still a problem. Like, we are overriding backgrounds of the button, but the pattern library should define them, right? Like, why would I need to override colors somewhere else for a button? So this, it comes down to having a really flexible way to enable changes. So this is an amazing way to extend stuff, and this works pretty well. But on the other hand, the base component style and the overrides are in different files, so when you change one, you don't know the side effects that you could have in your code base, so you kind of defy the purpose of having modularity. And in the same way, you kind of define the purpose of having patterns, because you are basically creating patterns every time you override something. So yeah, it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't really live well with the idea of a pattern library or a modular system. It's kind of out of context on that. Another thing I've seen and I've done is ad hoc BAM-like modifiers. This is the actual use case. You are too tall. Anybody ever told you that you might be too small? So again, you got a dialogue, a generic dialogue, and then you got this dialogue user intent. The good thing about this practice is that the user intent lives in the dialogue. So when you change the base dialogue, you can see immediately what things you need to take care of. The thing, though, is that it doesn't quite scale, because how many of these super specific exceptions could you have in your CSS if this escalates at some point? Again, it works because there is flexibility. You can have ad hoc solutions for simple use cases, and you have control because everything lives in the same space, and when you open your CSS, everything is there. But on the other hand, the generic component shouldn't know about specific implementations. Like, those classes sounded like not really modifiers, but IDs, which is kind of odd in a modular system. And also, you bring along a huge amount of potential dialogues everywhere you have one dialogue, which means that the CSS of your site is bloated of stuff that you're not actually using. And again, it doesn't scale much, because how many can you really add without losing control of your code base? Next on, predefined modifiers. This is actually the modifiers, the BAM-like modifiers. So you have a dialogue that becomes a dialogue prompt, which is a generic use of that. The dialogue prompt is looks pretty much like the specific use case modifiers, with the difference that has a semantic value and a reusability purpose, not a specific implementation one. It works. It's actually, again, the reason why we have modifiers in the first place. But there are two reasons why I wouldn't abuse of this technique. One is that it might lead you to preventive abstraction. You might be wired to see these patterns when they're not patterns at all. And it doesn't necessarily work all the time. You cannot abstract everything to be a generic thing anyway. And also, personally, I would change the code a little bit to express differently what I'm trying to do, because the class is still a class name injection, right? There is still potential user mistake and mistyping the class name or something, while if you have a type or a wrapping component in React, that would be much better, I think. Anyway, just to sum up a few things I've seen, none of them really works, right, in the way we might want it to work. So I still wish I could sleep, really. The thing is, I got to the point in which analyzing all these examples of code and analyzing our code base and trying to see where the smells were in our CSS and modular strategy, I got to the point in which I was stuck. And it actually is not that simple. So I tried to rethink about the question, I went back. And instead of try to frame these, I tried to look at that. Why we were doing those things, what we were trying to actually solve as a problem, rather than looking at the code and trying to infer from that. So in this part, I'm trying to analyze reasons why we went that way and try to figure out alternative solutions to solve the same problem without injecting classes or defining modifiers. So one of the things that happened quite often for us was to arrange components within their parent and wrapper component. And one solution to that, which is a potential good one, is to have a wrapping div. This technique brings with it a good thing, is that the children component would be flexible, and the parent component would give boundaries, which is kind of what happens in families, right? You got the parent that sets the rule, and the kid needs to stay in the boundaries of the rule, in a sense. So this is good because everything lives in the right space. You have the right responsibility level. The game intent defines how much the dialogue needs, how big the dialogue needs to be there, and the dialogue itself doesn't care where it's mounted. It just adapts. And it does work. For that, it's quite neat. It keeps this responsibility level correct. I think it doesn't validate the patterns, even though, again, you might end up having a website in which you have different dialog sizes depending on the context. And it's very different from the class name injection because, again, you're not injecting a class name on the dialog. You're injecting the class name on another element, not touching the dialog styles anyway. The problem is, of course, that you might end up with having a whole amount of divs around items that you might not really want. Like your DOM will probably get bloated a bit. So there are pros and cons as well. Another problem we had quite often was the space relation between components, not much positioning them in the parent, but out-position them between each other. And one technique that could help with that is to define spaces and have helper classes that do that rather than extending the patterns themselves. This, of course, is brutal, in a sense, in the code, but it does reduce the need to come up with classes and new names for stuff that is generic, and it brings back the conversation about spaces and relationship between components in the pattern library level. So with the designer, you can come up with a set of rules on how your components should behave between each other. And that is codified in your pattern library. It's not anymore left to this specific use case. They need to be 2 pixels, blah, 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 and stuff like that. On the counter, though, the positional classes might get stale if they're not codified. Like if you don't do that step of pattern library, then those classes are meaningless, really. And the flexibility is limited. And to a certain extent, if you want to go down that path, have you considered going to atomic CSS as a whole? Like, just do that. Like, if you want to embrace a class to add a margin, use what is meant for that. Again, most people don't like atomic CSS, and I'm part of that group. But like, for me, this feels as dirty in a sense, and it doesn't convey the same message. Like, how much is space max? While this tells me exactly what's happening there. So in terms of maintainability and working with it, probably it's easier. The last thing which I found is the one that brings more joy to me as a developer is what I call open components. By open components, I mean that the icon that in this system is flexible in width and height, instead of invoking it and override width and height, would express itself with an API that allows the parent component to require the size. So the icon CSS defines what the icon takes as parameters, and the question block just uses that to define what type of icon, what size of icon is required. The responsibility is clear and is flexible enough because it's up to you to open up certain APIs. And the developer, again, can control it, can have a fine-tuning of what can be overridden and what not. And what's overridden is always overridden in the file of the component owning that space. Is never in the wrong context, which is, to a certain extent, great. And again, as a developer, I find it really comforting to have this sort of control. Of course, this technique involves a little more complexity, because you have to, like, your CSS is not going to be as simple as linear as it used to be. And then, again, an open component in a pattern library might not be what you want, really. You might want to have codified components rather than components that adapt. But that's probably up to a broader conversation, in a sense. So the question is, does it get easier with these things in mind? OK.
Does it get easier?
No. Yes. It gets easier.
Oh, yeah? Look at you.
Thanks. The more you know who you are and what you want, the less you let things upset you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the more you know what you are and what you want, the less you let things upset you. And I think this is kind of the point of my talk, in a sense. Like, looking at the code sometimes doesn't make any sense. The scene continues with her saying, I just don't know what I'm supposed to be. And again, probably that's the problem. Probably it's us not exactly knowing what we are trying to build. So probably the issue is even different, is how do we understand and convey the meaning of the exception that we have requested to implement. So probably what we need to do, rather than trying to start coding, is to learn what the pattern we are building is supposed to be. Maybe it's not the pattern that we think it is. Maybe we should abstract some code and build 2 different patterns instead. So we need to get involved early, because that's easier to understand what we're building. We need to talk to people. We need to talk to designers. We need to talk to PMs. We need to be inclusive in our conversation with everyone else and not just be heads down on our laptop. And we need to remember that we are not hopeless. And that was me. Thank you.